Picture this. While America was planting flags on the moon and getting all the glory, the Soviets were doing something far stranger. They were building metal coffins designed to survive literal hell. Not metaphorical hell. Actual, scientifically accurate hell. We're talking about a place where lead melts like butter, where the air pressure would crush a submarine, and where it rains sulfuric acid. And here's the wildest part. They succeeded multiple times. The Soviet Union became the only civilization in human history to land on Venus and send back pictures. Not NASA, not SpaceX, the Soviets. And then they just stopped. The question isn't why they were obsessed with Venus. The question is, what did they find that made them give up? Because something changed. Something made them walk away from decades of success. And today, we're going to uncover exactly what happened in one of the most underrated space programs in history. Let's rewind to the early 1960s. The space race is heating up, and both superpowers are looking for their next big target. Mars? Boring. Early telescope observations showed it was basically a red desert with some ice caps, like Arizona, but worse. The Moon? America was already calling dibs on that shiny rock. But Venus? Venus was the mysterious girl at the space party that nobody really understood. She was Earth's twin sister in size, she was closer to us than Mars, and most importantly, she wore a thick veil of clouds that nobody could see through. This drove scientists absolutely mad with curiosity. Here's where it gets interesting. In the 1950s and early 60s, scientists genuinely didn't know what was under those clouds. Some thought it might be a tropical paradise, warm, humid, maybe covered in swamps and prehistoric plants like Earth was millions of years ago. Others speculated about oceans of carbonated water. A few bold voices, including a young Carl Sagan, suggested something far more sinister, a runaway greenhouse effect that had turned the planet into a pressure cooker. But these were just educated guesses. Nobody knew for sure. And the Soviets? They decided they were going to be the ones to find out, even if it killed them. Or, more accurately, even if it killed dozens of their expensive spacecraft. The Americans were focused on prestige missions, things that look good on camera, like moon landings and astronaut parades. But the Soviets took a different approach. They wanted scientific firsts, and Venus represented the ultimate first, landing on another planet. Not just flying by, not just orbiting, actually landing and surviving long enough to tell us what hell looks like up close. They called it the Venera program, and it would become the most brutal, expensive, and ultimately successful interplanetary mission in Soviet history. Now, if you think the Soviets just waltzed into Venus and nailed it on the first try, you're in for a reality check. The early Venera missions were an absolute disaster parade. Venera 1, launched in 1961, lost contact with Earth after just a week. It probably flew past Venus eventually, but nobody knows because it ghosted them harder than a bad Tinder date. Venera 2 and 3, same story. Communication failures, systems breakdowns, or they just disappeared. Engineers were pulling their hair out. Political pressure was mounting. The Kremlin was dumping resources into these missions, expecting results, and all they were getting were expensive metal coffins that either died in space or vanished without a trace. But here's what's fascinating about the Soviet approach. Failure didn't mean cancellation. In the West, a few failed missions and Congress starts asking uncomfortable questions about budgets. In the Soviet system, failure meant build it tougher and try again. Venera 4, launched in 1967, finally gave them something to work with. It managed to enter Venus's atmosphere and send back data for 93 minutes before the signal died. At first, they thought it had landed. Celebrations in Moscow, vodka flowed. But then the scientists looked at the data more carefully and realized something horrifying. Venera 4 had died 15 miles above the surface. It hadn't landed, it had been crushed by the atmosphere. The pressure was so intense that their probe, designed to withstand what they thought were extreme conditions, had been squeezed like a soda can in a hydraulic press. This is when the Soviets realized they weren't just exploring another planet, they were trying to land in the most hostile environment in the solar system. Venus wasn't Earth's twin, it was Earth's evil twin who went completely off the rails. The data from Venera 4 revealed temperatures above 250 degrees Celsius and pressures dozens of times higher than Earth's atmosphere. But instead of giving up, the Soviet engineers did something incredible. They went back to the drawing board and asked themselves, how do we build something that can survive the apocalypse? The solution the Soviets came up with was both brilliant and absolutely insane. They basically said, okay, if Venus is going to crush our probes, we'll build something that's more tank than spacecraft. Venera 7, launched in 1970, was a masterpiece of brutal engineering. They built it with a titanium pressure sphere, thick enough to withstand pressures equivalent to being 3,000 feet underwater. They stripped out every piece of unnecessary equipment. No cameras on this one, just instruments to measure temperature, pressure, and survival. The designers assumed the probe would be destroyed, so they built it to transmit data right up until the moment it died. And then something miraculous happened. On December 15, 1970, Venera 7 became the first human-made object to land on another planet and transmit data from the surface. The signal was weak, barely detectable, but it was there. For 23 minutes, this Soviet spacecraft sat on the surface of Venus, screaming its measurements back to Earth before the heat finally killed it. The readings? Surface temperature, 475 degrees Celsius, hot enough to melt lead. Atmospheric pressure, 92 times Earth's atmosphere, equivalent to being 900 meters underwater. This wasn't a planet, this was a medieval torture chamber designed by physics itself. But the Soviets weren't done. Not even close. They'd proven they could land on Venus. Now they wanted pictures. This presented an entirely new engineering nightmare. Cameras have lenses, and lenses are made of glass, and glass doesn't particularly enjoy being heated to temperatures where lead becomes liquid. They needed cooling systems, they needed shielding, they needed cameras that could survive long enough to take a photo and transmit it before melting into slag. Venera 9 and 10, launched in 1975, carried the first cameras to another planet's surface. When Venera 9 transmitted the first image back to Earth, the entire scientific world lost its mind. There it was, the surface of Venus. Jagged rocks, a dim orange sky, a landscape that looked like a volcanic wasteland under perpetual twilight. It was hauntingly beautiful and absolutely terrifying. And for the first time, humanity could see what hell actually looked like. The late 1970s and early 1980s were the glory days of the Venera program. The Soviets were on a roll, launching mission after mission, each one more sophisticated than the last. Venera 11 and 12 carried microphones, yes, actual microphones, to record the sound of Venus's winds. Imagine that, the sound of wind on an alien world, howling across a hellscape of volcanic rock under crushing pressure. Venera 13 and 14 brought color cameras and lasted even longer on the surface, over 2 hours in some cases. They drilled into the rocks, analyzed the soil, and confirmed that Venus's surface was geologically similar to Earth's volcanic regions. Basalt, volcanic tuff, the building blocks of lava fields. Venus had once been volcanically active, maybe still was. But here's where things get really interesting. The Soviets developed a landing technique that was so clever it still impresses engineers today. Because Venus's atmosphere is so incredibly dense, about 90 times thicker than Earth's, they realized they didn't need parachutes for the final descent. The atmosphere itself acted like a cushion. They designed aerobrakes that would slow the probe down, and then at the last moment, shock absorbers would take the final impact. It was like landing on a cloud made of concrete. This technique only worked because Venus's atmosphere was so thick, and it's a method that's almost useless anywhere else in the solar system. The Soviets had essentially invented a landing system for a planet that nobody else was crazy enough to visit. The data kept rolling in. Venus's clouds weren't water, they were sulfuric acid. The atmospheric pressure at the surface wasn't just high, it was crushing, in the most literal sense. Wind speeds at altitude reached 200 miles per hour, but on the surface, because the atmosphere was so dense, winds moved at a walking pace, yet carried the force of a hurricane. This was a planet where the laws of physics played by different rules. And through it all, these Soviet machines kept working, kept transmitting, kept surviving just long enough to give humanity an unprecedented look at our neighboring world. No other nation has matched this achievement. Not America, not Europe, not China. The Soviets remain the only ones to successfully land on Venus and live to tell about it. And then, silence. After Venera 14 in 1981, the missions started to wind down. Venera 15 and 16 were orbiters, focused on radar mapping, not landers. The Soviet Union attempted a few more ambitious missions, Vega 1 and 2 in 1984, which dropped balloons into Venus's atmosphere before continuing on to Halley's Comet, but the era of landing on Venus was essentially over. By the mid-1980s, the Soviet Union had bigger problems than Venus. The economy was crumbling, political instability was rising, and the USSR itself was approaching its expiration date. Space exploration budgets got slashed, priorities shifted. Mars, with its potential for harboring ancient life and its more forgiving environment, became the sexy new target for exploration. But there's something else going on here, something that doesn't get talked about enough. The Soviets had essentially learned everything they could learn with the technology available. Each probe lasted a couple of hours at most before being destroyed. They'd taken pictures, analyzed rocks, recorded sounds, measured everything measurable. What else was there to do? Build a probe that could last 3 hours instead of 2? The returns were diminishing. Venus had revealed its secrets. It was a hellish, inhospitable wasteland, with no life, no water, no future as a place humans could ever visit. In a way, the Soviets had won their obsession. They'd conquered Venus, and in conquering it, they'd discovered there was nothing there worth conquering. There's a beautiful irony in this. The Soviet Union, a nation built on 5-year plans and ideological determination, had thrown everything at Venus for 25 years. They'd achieved the impossible, created engineering marvels that still haven't been matched, and proved they could land on the most hostile world in the inner solar system. And what did they find? A dead planet. A cautionary tale about greenhouse gases. A world that showed us what Earth could become if we really screwed up our climate. Venus didn't offer hope or resources or future colonization potential. It offered a warning. And maybe, in the end, that's the most valuable thing it could have given us. Here's what blows my mind about the Venera program. Modern spacecraft can't do what those Soviet probes did. Think about that for a second. We have better computers, better materials, better everything, but we can't replicate what the Soviets achieved with 1970s technology. Why? Because modern electronics are delicate. They're optimized for efficiency, miniaturization, power consumption. Soviet electronics were built like tanks because they had to be. vacuum tubes instead of transistors in some cases, thick metal housings, redundant systems. They were over-engineered in the best possible way. Today's spacecraft are Formula One race cars, fast, efficient, sophisticated. The Venera probes were Soviet dump trucks, crude, heavy, and indestructible. NASA has been talking about returning to Venus for decades, but every mission proposal hits the same wall. Keeping modern electronics alive in Venus's environment is incredibly difficult and expensive. The European Space Agency has concepts, private companies have ideas, but nobody's actually done it since the Soviets. There's been some radar mapping from orbit, sure, but putting something on the surface and getting it to work, that's still the Soviet record to beat. And in 2021, when NASA announced 2 new Venus missions, Veritas and Da Vinci Plus, the space community collectively said, "About time," because we've ignored Venus for almost 40 years while focusing on Mars. The Soviets didn't just explore Venus, they showed us what determination looks like. They failed, adapted, failed again, adapted more, and kept going until they succeeded. No public opinion polls to worry about, no Congress to justify budgets to every year, just engineers given a problem and told to solve it. That's both the blessing and curse of the Soviet system. It could achieve incredible things through sheer force of will, but it was ultimately unsustainable. The same determination that landed on Venus couldn't save the USSR itself. But the legacy remains. Those images from Venera 9, 13, and 14, they're the only photographs we have from Venus's surface. They're historical documents, scientific treasures, and testaments to human capability. So why were the Soviets obsessed with Venus? Because it was there, because it was unknown, and because solving impossible problems was what they did. They didn't find tropical paradise or alien civilizations. They found hell, documented it, survived it, and moved on. Sometimes the greatest achievements are the ones that teach us where not to go. Venus taught us that Earth is precious, that planetary atmospheres are delicate, and that some places in the universe are better observed from a safe distance. But here's the real question. Should we go back? Should humanity return to Venus, or have we already learned everything we need to know? If you could send one more mission to Venus with unlimited budget, what would you want it to discover? Drop your answer in the comments below. I'm genuinely curious what you think. And if you enjoyed this deep dive into one of history's most underrated space programs, hit that subscribe button because we've got more forgotten space history coming your way. There are dozens of incredible missions that never got the recognition they deserved, and we're going to uncover them all. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.